This build is predicated on two core ideas. The first is that Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm allows your totems to inherit your endurance charges and can constantly spam attacks as if they are removing your charges without actually doing so. Believe it or not, this interaction, whether intended or not, does work. 5-5 has a slower verification in his video featuring a really high damage version of this build. The second core foundational piece of this build is Wilma's Requital and dual scaling with it. While we see some Wilma setups use Mana Forged Arrows with Soul Ascension, I found these particular gloves to be quite frustrating to use, especially as your build actually starts to do good damage. It's basically a form of catch-up scaling for extremely weak builds or for extremely hard content. Instead, I opt for a self-ignite setup with two Moko's Embrace rings as a Chieftain, each ring giving effectively 96% increased attack speed. Despite all this power, I find this build to be basically unplayable, simply because it's too clunky even for me. Firstly, I manually cast 2, sometimes 3 Warcries to give a huge damage burst. I personally don't like this. I don't know how people league started slams, but I can't even do it on a totem setup. Secondly, the self-ignite setup in this case is poorly theorized. Moku's only gives you a 50% chance to self-ignite when you're equipped with 2 of them when taking damage. Thus, I use Forbidden Right linked with Unleash, which slows down your cast time, and it does generally proc then each time I cast it because of the multiple casts. On rare occasion though, this does fail and I need to cast again. Further, this needs to be done every 4 seconds. While in theory you have enough free time on a totem build to do this, in practice it just isn't fun. If you want to see a much higher damage setup, I've linked 5-5's video in the description of this one, and I would say that as an all-rounder, the General's Cry setup for Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm, popularized last league, still probably outperforms Earthbreaker this league, even with the brokenness of Wilma scaling. There's still some cool tech in this build despite the relatively awkward results, so let's just talk about some of that stuff in the POV. There's really only 2 main things that I really want to talk about when it comes to this build in detail. The first is Supreme Ostentation. I think on left-sided builds, they really tend to want to stay left-sided. Some of them will go towards here for like suppression and stuff, or even through the middle, but generally you'll be in a huge lack of both dexterity and intelligence, and Ostentation is definitely something more people should be thinking about. This is obviously an incomplete build, so I didn't really make use of it, but you can be tattooing a lot of your tree, and there's just so much power built into this. You know, there's things like multi, increased damage. Generally for any given build, there's probably like 5 to 10 useful notables, like highly valuable notables that you can be playing with Elegant Hubris, and Ostentation is just so strong for anything that isn't, I guess, a pure stat stacker or a mana or in stacking type build that really wants to get like intelligence. So just something to be thinking about. The second thing I want to talk about is this. Scions is actually pretty strong, and it's probably something I want to think about running more, especially if I go to like Juggernaut later in the league. I was really under the impression that Warcries are pretty much used for exertions these days, especially with the addition of auto exertion and that sort of thing. But I noticed that like these 2 Warcries alone are really strong even for this build. Infernal Cry gives me like almost 50% more damage, 43% more damage. Because it gives you Fizz as per buff, and Battle Mage's Cry gives you a ton of critical strike chance. It actually crit cats me, and if I wasn't like, you know, if I bounce things out properly, you can see BMC is at 23.5. So I think this is a really strong node, but it also enables one more thing, which is a ton of rage generation. General's Cry for me is on my auto exertion setup, and this is on a really low cooldown. Because I'm running this setup, you know, it gives you basically your full rage. You can't run things like Berserk, but even for a setup with just this mastery and running max rage, you can get a lot of rage generation. I just think that Warcries are, I guess from my point of view, something I just like didn't consider enough. And maybe Earthbreaker is something that could get more consideration as things move on. Dawnstrider is a really cheap pair of boots, so you know, getting a corruption of choice is always fairly easy to do. In this case, I built an endurance charge stacker. But you can see that in the end, the numbers of this build weren't too impressive or anything. The playstyle was kind of okay-ish, if that, but the actual like button pressing playstyle was really terrible. So yeah, that's the build, and I hope, I guess the next one, I'm probably gonna stay on the totem thing for a little bit because there's one more ballista build that I want to play for this league.